Hello, geeks and geekettes. It's time once again. It's Wednesday morning. Time for me to do some more nerd-splaining as I answer your questions about what it is I do for a living. What I do for a living is I write comic books. And if you have a question for me, the most direct way to get to me is at brunobookstore@gmail.com. And you can ask me questions, ask your questions there, make suggestions, and even reach me personally. And as many of you know, I reply pretty quickly to emails at this address. Plus, you get on my email list, find out about new projects way before anybody else. So that's the place if you want to ask a question and learn more about what I do for a living. And let's get to it. Arthur Tripp. We almost met at the 1975 Comic Con. Boy, I'd like to know the story behind that, how we almost met. Because I was just a fan then. Remember the question of mine was how Batman uses cape as a weapon, and tell your fans how Mr. Eisner, Will Eisner, saved vets in Vietnam through the PS magazine. Well, first question first. Um, I tried to weaponize Batman as much as possible. I wrote an entire story that answered the question, how can Batman leave the Batmobile parked on a city street and still expect to come back and find it where he left it? Uh, and in this story, I showed that the Batmobile was utterly and completely weaponized and able to fend for itself even while its owner was absent. I added a lot of weapons and gear and equipment to Batman's array because I thought, you know, those wonderful toys, as the Joker refers to them, I thought the supply of them would simply be endless. So there was no problem with creating tons of them. And I always thought, well, why not weaponize the cape as well? And I added a feature where there were some lead weights at the bottom corners of the cape. Not only did they help it drape well, but also Batman could, if necessary, swing his cape as a flail. And the weights, probably wouldn't be enough to knock someone unconscious, but certainly enough to cause them to take a step or two back as they got smacked in the face with, a 2 or 3 pound lead weight. So, yeah, I weaponized Batman. I made his cape. Um, Not lethal, but certainly an instrument that he could use to damage the wicked. Now, Will Eisner, almost everyone listening to this knows who Will Eisner is. Will Eisner was the creator of The Spirit, which started as a comic book supplement in a lot of newspapers back in the 40s and 50s. And Will Eisner is rightfully so credited as one of comic books' earliest auteurs and a revolutionary figure, a seminal figure in the American comic book because he took the comic book seriously. He took it as an adult medium and, did work that, landmark work in the area of comics with, the wonderful Spirit comic strip, which is at the heart of it an action adventure strip, but mass crime fighter, but it's so much more than that. There's a lot of social commentary there. There's a lot of heart in the stories, a lot of humor. He added elements to these stories that were not normally present in masked vigilante stories at the time. Some of the stories are lighthearted. Some of the stories are heartbreaking. There's a real emotional depth to the work that Eisner did, and let's not ignore Jules Pfeiffer. Um, his most frequent collaborator on the writing end. And if you're not familiar with the Spirit, you should be. You should try it out, find it, and read yourself some Spirit. But when the Spirit strip ended, Will Eisner, well, he kind of disappeared from comics. To comic fans anyway. I mean, he ran an enormous comic book studio. The Eisner Eiger studio produced tons of comics. But when the comic book business kind of fell apart, Eisner, left. And where did he go? Well, they got a contract with the United States Army to produce PS, the Preventive Maintenance Monthly. And this is a digest-sized book. I'm going to say it's about 48 pages, maybe less. And it ran for decades. Decades. It was only recently canceled. I think they went online with it and then ultimately canceled it. But what it is, and what Eisner and his studio created here, with obviously technical assistance from the Army, was a maintenance manual in comic book form for the Army. And it told you all kinds of things, and it got very, very technical about weaponry and vehicles and all kinds of ordnance and ammunition. And basically, it taught the troops in very simple, easy to understand lessons how to maintain the equipment that the taxpayers provided them. And, Eisner, like I said, for decades was the guy behind this magazine. I remember meeting Murphy Anderson in the 80s, and at that time, Murphy had taken over doing the artwork on these things. He had taken over from Eisner. I think maybe he had worked with Eisner toward the end of Eisner's run on PS Magazine. And yeah, you mentioned that it saved lives in Vietnam, and it may very well have, because these lessons that used graphics and humor and obviously sex, something that I mean, these things are relics of the past in the light of what's going on with our military today, with their various woke policies. PS Magazine, as it existed in Eisner's day, would never be allowed to exist. I mean, just look at some of these covers. And but the Army and Will Eisner understood what the GI's attention span would allow, and used humor and a hot looking babe to maintain their interest. And I think it probably did save lives, because you had to maintain this equipment, you had to keep it going, you had to keep it in running order, in fighting trim. And I'm sure an awful lot of GIs learned lessons from these digests on how to do just that. And then lessons that stuck, that may not have stuck, with some drill instructor or, some fobbit explaining them to them. As I said, Murphy Anderson took over the artwork on these for a long time. And then for an even longer time, Joe Kubert's studio produced PS Magazine. I don't know. I think Kubert's people may have been producing it right up until the very end. I'm not sure. I haven't seen any recent issues. I have a stack of these somewhere in my collection. They're pretty easy to find on eBay if you're curious to see what these things look like, and they're worth a look. If you're a real geek, if you're a real comic book aficionado, you're going to want to look at a couple of these just out of pure interest, and how they use the medium to instruct, and how probably the medium should be used more often to instruct on. It's a great educational tool, in my opinion. Comics are an awesome educational tool. They certainly increase my vocabulary. Dwayne Thomas, you have stated that in decades past there were huge numbers of female comic book readers, particularly of horror and romance books. When and why did the girls largely abandon comics when boys did not? Why did they not, and why have they not, to any real significant extent, ever returned? Yeah, I mean, we think incorrectly that comics are a boys' medium, and they weren't. For most of their history, the large majority of comic book readers were girls. And as Dwayne pointed out, they liked horror. They liked romance comics. Romance comics were the best-selling comics, selling in the millions every month. I mean, individual Young Romance sold 3 million copies a month at its prime. And they read Archie. They were the primary readers of Archie. But they also read Donald Duck and Mickey Mouse and Little Lulu and all the rest. but they were comic book readers. I mean, my older sisters read comic books. They read my Green Lantern comics because they thought Hal Jordan was cute. And he had an ongoing, relationship with a woman, which interested them as well. So, you know, yeah, why did they go away? They went away for the reason that the comic book industry in the 70s chased almost all of their readership away, is the heavy concentration on superheroes. And I don't think girls are particularly interested in superheroes, particularly the way they were written in the 70s. And so girls abandoned comics in droves, and but they were joined by the readers of Western comics and war comics and horror comics, as those readerships were largely abandoned or ignored or neglected, and everything became about superheroes, and that's where we are today. The one flavor American comic book output from the big two. Uh, Now, I think that there's, I know from my own experience, there's a lot of female readership for manga. And I've discussed this in earlier videos, why that is, because manga is more varied. There's more there for them. There's more comics that speak to them. But overall, I mean, X-Men, I think that the success of X-Men in comics through the 80s and 90s, the enormous success that they had was because of a female readership. Chris Claremont included a lot of prominent, believable, three-dimensional female characters into the stories. There was romance, there was intrigue. The stories were more complicated. Women, I'm not being sexist here. Women like a story that has some heart and some complication and surprises and twists and turns. Not that men don't, but you know, growing up, guys read Spider-Man. Oh, I read Spider-Man to see what happens in the fight. He's going to fight Dr. Octopus. He's going to fight the Vulture. Yeah, but what brought them back month by month was, is he ever going to make time with Betty Brant? Who's he going to pick, Mary Jane or Gwen? The soap opera aspect of Spider-Man brought you back month after month after month. Because you always knew there was going to be a fight, and you always knew Spider-Man was going to win ultimately. But the romance, the girl angle of Spider-Man provided, the real tension, the real suspense in that title. I think a lot of the success I had with Nightwing is because of female readership, even more so than Birds of Prey. We got a lot of letters from female readers. When I was on Savage Sword of Conan, we got a lot of letters from housewives. they'd always let you know in the letter that they were a housewife, and they enjoyed reading Savage Sword of Conan. So it's easy to get them back, create material that they like. But unfortunately, starting in the 2000s, in the 70s, 80s, and 90s, there was no real effort made to bring in female readers. Starting in the 2000s, there was an effort made to chase them away. Marvel had a long-running series by Tom DeFalco and Ron Frenz called Spider-Girl, which did okay in the direct market, but did gangbusters in the book market. They would print these smaller digest-size reprints of Spider-Girl, and they sold in numbers. These were trade paperbacks that sold in numbers greater than most of the monthly comics sold at the time. They were a phenomenon. But Marvel didn't like them. The powers that be at Marvel didn't like them. They thought that Tom DeFalco and Ron Frenz were kind of over, even though, hundreds of thousands of girls were buying these comics. They were finding them at Borders bookstore and at Barnes and Noble, and they were finding them at their library, and they were reading them. They were extraordinarily popular, and but it wasn't the audience that Marvel wanted, and that's kind of the history of comics from say 2000 on. Both of the big two companies pursuing audiences, the audience they preferred, which unfortunately is an audience that doesn't exist. As I often say, Marvel and DC from 2000 onward were aimed at hipsters who live below 14th Street in Manhattan. And those guys and gals, they don't read comics. So no matter how much you pander to them, they weren't going to read them. So could they bring readership back? Yeah, it's back. It's back, except they're all reading manga. So part of the huge explosion of manga is girls returning to the comic book reading habit. And there you go. It's an issue I've been concerned with since I started writing comics. I always want to make my comics as universally appealing as possible. And the more female readers I could get, the happier I was, because they're actually more loyal readers than the male readers. So there you go. Another question from Millennial Man. Chuck, what is the most interesting story you've written in your opinion, and what is the premise to a story you have yet to write? The most interesting thing I ever worked on was an adaptation of Amity Schlee's The Forgotten Man. I worked on this project pretty much hand in hand with Amity, and it's a history of the Great Depression. And it's a very detailed history of the Great Depression, and it very much lent itself to being a comic book because there's a rich ensemble cast of characters. It has good guys, has bad guys, and obviously being the story of America in one of its darkest periods, it's an epic story. And it was one of the most interesting things I worked on. And I was approached through a lawyer agent that I had worked with who was at a cocktail party. and Amity Schlees, who is an economist, the woman is brilliant. She's brilliant. Every time we spoke on the phone, I was exhausted afterwards. We're just trying to keep up with her because she has a nimble mind, and the store of knowledge in Amity's head is just astounding, and her passion for the work and her passion for history were impressive. So this lawyer agent that I knew was talking to Amity Schlees, and Amity Schlees had done this best-selling book, The Forgotten Man, and was interested in turning it into something that she wanted to expand the readership from it. She was interested in turning it into a comic book form. And the lawyer agent that I know said, I can only think of one person who would tackle this. Number one, because of the politics, calling into question the efficacy of the New Deal, dealing with how the Depression moved the United States toward fascism for a while, dangerously close to fascism. Aspects of the Great Depression that aren't normally taught or normally thought of in conventional histories. And this is what Amity delved into. And so, yeah, I was the only person that was ever going to tackle this in comics, the only working comics professional who was ever going to do this. So I talked to Amity, and she says, well, I don't know much about comics. I don't know anyone in comics. Who will we get to draw this? And I said, my first choice is Paul Ravoche. He's a Canadian artist, a genius. And I said, number one, Paul has a versatile style, and we're going to need a guy who's really versatile in this book because we're going to deal with a lot of different, from in-period political cartoon style to more realistic, almost photorealistic work. We need a really good storyteller. We need somebody who's smart and capable. And I knew from Paul's work and from some communications I had had with him over the years that he was a guy that could do this. And I said, and most importantly, Amity, we need a guy that can draw hats. Because if there's anything, any signature object of the 1930s in America, it is hats. And as you can see here, I was right. An amazing number of comic book artists, even really good ones, are not very good at drawing hats. They always look like they're made out of clay. I mean, some are good at it, but there's some very, very talented comic book artists who are terrible at drawing hats, how the hat is situated on the head, how it looks, everything else. As you can see here, Paul, yeah, I was right. Paul nailed it. So it was up to me to contact Paul. Now, I had no idea. I talked to Paul about comics and about artwork and the rest of it, but we'd never talked politics. And I approached him with this, and he was interested. And I said, now, this is going to take a very politically unpopular view of the Great Depression. It's a more jaundiced view of Franklin Delano Roosevelt's efforts and Herbert Hoover and people like that. And found out that Paul's politics were kind of in line with that. So he had no problem with the political end of this book and what it was trying to portray. So then we were off to the races. And, it was an interesting project because it was challenging. I mean, this material has the potential to be very dry, but Amity's book had a lot of drama in it. For a history of something like the Great Depression, with it's an economic history. The book is a page turner. It's like a thriller. And I urge you, not only if check out the graphic novel, but check out the original book itself. So I began an adaptation, and I wrote, I believe, like a 150-page graphic novel, and then Amity and Paul took over from there. And I always joke that I taught Amity how to write comics because I was cutting material that she didn't want cut, and I was like, well, there's only so much real estate in a graphic novel. But I was wrong, because this thing's almost 300 pages when she got done writing it. But it is an epic. It's a gorgeous, gorgeous project. I urge you to check it out if you can. And now, as far as interesting projects I've always got projects in mind, in my head. But I'll tell you one, and it's a high concept kind of thing. I want to do a story, either a graphic novel or just a regular prose novel, about a Roman bireme, a Roman naval ship during the period of, I'm going to say around Nero period, the end of the Claudian period. It's a Roman bireme, and it's returning from Britain, Roman Brittany, and it gets knocked off course in a storm. And basically they are lost at sea, far from the sight of land. And after weeks of deprivation, wash up on the shores of what would be the state of Maine in the New World. and there they run into the Indian tribes that populated that part of the continent. And, great big action story, sense of wonder kind of thing, setting the Roman Empire, legionnaires against, Native Americans. And maybe I'll get around to doing it. I've been researching it for years, putting stuff together. And I picked Maine because, man, there were some badass tribes up there. So, it'd be an interesting action adventure story. So, JDC, John Coates. I was rereading your Savage Tales magazine stories, and my favorites are those illustrated by the legendary John Severin. Can you elaborate on your personal and working relationship, how he became involved, and if you ever met him? Savage Tales magazine was initially like a Conan-centric Marvel magazine. It was displaced by Savage Sword of Conan. And then in the mid-'80s, Larry Hama brought it back as a action-adventure anthology. War stories, Western stories, gonzo action stories. The series The Nom comes out of Savage Tales magazine, and it was like the comic book equivalent of a 1950s, 1960s sweat magazine, very much aimed at men, very much aimed at like guys doing life, or truck drivers, just a guy comic. Sadly, it only ran 8 issues. There were some problems with soliciting the first issue that put us behind the 8-ball sales-wise. And we just didn't get on the newsstand the way we should have, because this was a newsstand book. And this is my first big break at Marvel. This is where, I ended up approaching Larry. When I heard about this magazine, I had to be on it. I mean, this is my wheelhouse. War, Western stories, tough guy stuff, history, and doing it with someone who cares about this stuff. I mean, Larry is deeply, deeply involved, deeply, deeply interested in this kind of story, and I wanted to be on it really, really bad. And I did get to work with John Severin, you quite aptly say the legendary John Severin. I got to work with him 5 times. And what happened was I sent in some Westerns and some war stories. And at the time, I wasn't a full-time professional comic book writer. I was working at an insurance company as a security guard. And a lot of times I would have to call Larry on my breaks at work. And uh, one time he called me. He called me at my job and said, I'm going to give all your Western scripts to John Severin, if that's all right with you. Whenever it very much was all right with me. And so, and then I learned in later years, Larry said that, he didn't give them to John Severin just on a whim, that Severin actually asked. After he did this story, Long Ride Home, he asked, do you have any more scripts by this guy? So, you know, quite frankly, if my career had ended right there, if my comic career had ended right there, I would still be a happy man today, because I just admired John's work so much, and to have him do one of my Western stories, amazing. But he didn't only do one, he did four. We did another story, The Canyon of the Three, which is based on a real historical event where the cavalry pursuing Apaches through canyons in New Mexico run into a bit of trouble. And again, it was John's, total authority for the research, the look, everything about the Old West. We did another pretty much straight up tough guy Western about a Texas lawman goes down to Mexico, captures a bad guy, and he has a little bit of trouble at the border getting this guy home. That just a fun shoot 'em up action Western. And another story that had a little bit more heart, a little bit more emotional weight, The Stray, and it was about an Indian, Native American, maybe a Ute, I don't know, I didn't identify the tribe, who has a ranch, and he gets rustled. One of his one of his calves gets rustled, and he goes and gets it back. It's a very simple story, good story, plainly told. And again, John just drew the living hell out of it. Now, our ultimate opus, and my favorite story of all of them, as much as I love those Western stories, we did a story called By Rail to Vladivostok, which I pretty much wrote as a love letter to John Severin. And it was set in the Russian Civil War. And as a lot of Americans don't know, the beginning days of the Russian Civil War, right after the end of World War One, the United States sent troops to Archangel in Russia. They were largely troops from Wisconsin and Michigan because they thought they could stand the cold. And our troops were involved in a lot of mission creep. they were supposed to basically just guard the port of Archangel, and then they ended up guarding the Trans-Siberian Railroad. They went as far east as Vladivostok, which is as far east as you can go in Russia. And they were spread out all over, and they encountered the Bolsheviks, and they got into some desperate fighting in the colds of Siberia. And I desperately wanted to do a story in this period with John Severin. I wanted American soldiers killing Bolsheviks. It was like my gift to John Severin, because he was as virulent an anti-communist as I happened to be. And I thought, the one time there was a set-to fight between American troops and the Red Army, I wanted to do a story about that. And I remember talking to Larry Hama about it and saying, I want to do this Russian Civil War story, but how do I explain and set up the Russian Civil War enough for an 8-page story? I mean, there's just no room. And Larry said, sit down and explain it, which is the best advice I could have gotten. I just do this very perfunctory introduction about what the Russian Civil War is all about, and then we get right into the action. And this is the one time I was ever in communication with Mr. Severin, because he called me on the phone. And at the time, I was living on my sister's horse farm. And if you've ever lived on a horse farm or even visited a horse farm, you know that within 10 minutes of your arrival, you're going to end up with a pitchfork in your hands, because there's always stalls to be mucked. And when people own a horse farm, they expect everyone to pitch in. So I was out in the barn cleaning out a stall when my niece called from the house and said, there's a phone call for you. She's calling across a barnyard. And I'm like, well, tell him I'll call him back. Who is it? And she said, it's somebody named John Severin. Well, I ran the 4-minute mile back to the house, got on the phone breathless. And I said, oh, Mr. Severin, it's a joy to hear from you. What can I do for you? And he had a question about the rifles that I had chosen for the characters in this story by Rail to Vladivostok, what rifles they could use. And he said that, I don't think they use that particular rifle. I think they use this other one. And he says, I just moved and I don't have any of my reference handy. It's all still in boxes, but I'm going from memory. He drew the story from memory. And if you go back and look at any kind of historical record, I recently watched film of this period. My God, he remembered all these details particular to these units. I mean, look at those hats. Those aren't hats that were standard issue in the American Army at the time. And amazing. And the Red Army as well. I mean, trying to find reference material on what the Red Army looked like during the Russian Civil War in the 1980s was near impossible. He must have the most enormous morgue, and it was all in his head. The incredible visual memory this guy had. And so I just said, look, Mr. Severin, if you said they used ray guns, I'd say, okay, fine, because you're the guy. I like to think I do my homework, but I bow to your judgment. And he said, okay, well then I'll just make it the Springfield rifle, and we'll go from there. And I said, awesome. And of course, when I saw the artwork, I was just completely and utterly blown away. Did I ever meet him in person? Sadly, no, and I tried. He was supposed to be a guest at a San Diego con one year, and I spent most of that con looking for him, but he simply never showed up. Because I wanted to meet him, and also I desperately wanted to ask him if I could buy any originals from the stories that we worked on together, which sadly I never got to do. And I never met him, and he passed, and we were all poorer for it. But boy, getting to work with him, I mean, it was literally a dream come true. The weird thing is one of the Westerns, A Long Ride Home, I had written in the 70s with the idea in mind that if I ever got to work with John Severin, this is a story I'd want him to draw. And he drew it. Like I said, if my comic book writing career ended with just these stories, I'd be the happiest guy in the world. Paul Riley, can you tell us a little more about Rock and Roll Ninja? I understand the plot, but who are the main characters? What are their personalities? What makes each one different from the others? Rock and Roll Ninja is a series that I'm working on. It's an idea from Richard Meyer with amazing art by Matt Barr, who I've never worked with before. Guy's astounding. And Richard, as always, comes up with these zany, crazy ideas. And the basic idea is it's about four guys who are a long-range reconnaissance patrol team in Vietnam, and they return to the United States. They're rotated out, and they return to the United States, and they're all from New York City, and they're all interested in music, and they form their own band and start. And this is at the time of CBGB and things like that. The punk and new wave movement are coming up, and there's all these clubs all over Manhattan and Brooklyn. And now what makes them different from each other? I mean, we've got some pretty wild differences. We got a guy, he's addicted to drugs. We've got a guy who's into tech. We've got a guy who's a cross-dresser. It's 80s New York. We go from 70s Vietnam to 80s New York. And, and the plot's crazy because they eventually encounter ninjas who train them, and they become ninjas. And when they try to leave the ninja clan, that's when the trouble starts. But like I said, it's Matt Barr artwork. As you can see, it's highly detailed. He's a terrific cartoonist, but he brings the drama home as well. Just an all-around pure comic book kind of guy. And he's poured his heart and soul to these pages. It's amazing. And the things that Richard and I have asked him to draw, I mean, it's pretty ambitious. But the art's coming along, and it's looking really good. If you go on Indiegogo, you can find it. It's still, I don't know if the crowdfunder is still going on, but you can still participate, however that works. But Rock and Roll Ninja, go check it out at Indiegogo. Hendrix How did you approach writing the growing romance between Babs, Barbara Gordon, and Dick Grayson back in the 90s? How do you generally approach writing about any kind of romance in comics? Lastly, how would you have written Dick and Babs' relationship had it been allowed to continue? Would you have sought to get them married, just friends, or etc.? Probably not married. Probably wouldn't have ended there. I probably would have had them part ways amiably, because they're hero characters. I don't want them mad at each other. I don't want in their continuity they despise each other. But they would part ways for whatever reason. Oracle, Dick Grayson is not so complex a character. Barbara Gordon is. And it probably would be a reason that Barbara would be driven to push Dick away from her. And because, like I said, she's a more complicated character than Dick Grayson is. Dick Grayson is like the ultimate fantasy male figure, in that everything comes easy to him. He's a good-looking guy. He's athletic. He's got a good spirit and everything else. He's just not terribly complicated. Oracle, obviously, is a bit darker, and maybe that would be what drove them apart. But it was a lot of fun to write their relationship while it lasted. This seemed natural to me. I mean, a lot of people give me credit, oh man, how did you think of that? Well, just, they practically grew up together in the shadow of Batman. And it just seemed natural to me. Now, how do you write romance? Well, romance needs complications. What in Hollywood they used to call the love rack. What the love rack is, it's what draws the two lovers together, but also what draws them apart. Classic example, obviously, Romeo and Juliet. One's a Montague, one's a Capulet. The families hate each other. Okay, now, this is a formula that goes on and on and on. I mean, we see it today. One's a Hatfield, one's a McCoy, one's a vampire, one's a werewolf, one's a meat eater, one's a vegetarian. It's a complication that causes a rift and an attraction at the same time, because you can't just have boy meet girl, they live happily ever after. You got to have this tension. You got to have something constantly drawing them together, that attraction, that physical attraction, that sexual tension, or whatever, love. But there's also outside elements or even interior elements pulling them apart, something from their past, some other thing. Casablanca is an excellent example. I mean, Bogey plays, Rick. He's cynical. He doesn't want to get involved in World War II. He doesn't want to play a part in any of this. He's just going to stand aside while the world goes to war. And he has a history in the past with Ingrid Bergman, and they were hot and heavy lovers until France falls to the Nazis and they become separated. And then over time, they meet again. She's married. They meet in Casablanca. Rick owns a cafe, bar, popular hangout in Casablanca, and she's on the run with her husband, who's a German dissident, and his life is at risk. And the love rack here is, hey, they still got the hots for each other, but she's married, and she's involved in a cause, and Rick doesn't want any part of this cause. Okay, he's like, just leave this guy, stay with me, and we'll just sit out the war in a neutral country. And she doesn't want any part of that, but she wants to be with him, and he wants to be with her. And ultimately, Bogey has to make the decision, because she's drawn. She's going to leave her husband, leave the cause, turn her back on fighting fascism to be with Bogey. And Bogart is the one who says, he makes the noble decision that, no, we can't be together. I can't ask you to do that. And the famous speech about the problems of two people not mattering to mattering a hill of beans in the world as it is now. He says, this world is tearing itself apart. So Bogey does the noble thing, and he lets her go. He insists that she go with her husband and go off and continue to fight Nazism. And then it's very clear at the end of the film that this love rack, this romance, has changed him, and now he is going to become a willing participant in facing down this dark threat that threatens all of humanity. He's going to play a part in the conflict that's coming. So there's your love rack. I mean, that's a very complex story, but it all makes sense. It's true to human emotions. As Larry Hama once told me, don't write about human relationships until you've had one. Um, it's a keen understanding of how, the dynamics between men and women work, what makes them tick, and how they're different, but and why they're drawn together, and what could draw them apart. Now, the best examples and the clearest examples of the love rack, I think, that were ever produced in Hollywood, and Hollywood did it best, were the screwball comedies of the 30s and 40s. These were basically romantic comedies. They were the model for today's romantic comedies. If you see a movie, I don't know, name the actor, name the actress, they're always throwing these people together in films. Um, every romantic comedy goes back to the screwball comedies of the 30s and 40s. They're basically farces in which two completely different characters usually start out the film hating one another, usually start out the film with a million reasons why they would never have a damn thing to do with each other. And of course, their circumstances draw them back together again and again and again and again. And until, they overcome all the odds and, you know, fall in love and they have their happy ending. But it's all done with humor. Cary Grant, Jimmy Stewart, Myrna Loy, William Powell. I mean, all the greats. Irene Dunn, Jean Arthur. I mean, Hollywood cranked these out on a regular basis. All the studios made them, and Fred MacMurray and Claudette Colbert. I mean, they must have made a half a dozen of these, and they're formulaic in a way, but the writers were always very wisely trying to break that formula, bend and stretch and twist that formula so that the audience was continually surprised. I mean, even Hitchcock made one. Mr. and Mrs. Smith is an excellent uh, screwball romantic comedy with, oh my God, Robert Montgomery and, I'm blanking on the name, Carol Lombard. But to me, the ultimate romantic comedy. And the thing is, these are models of the love rack. Absolutely. They're funny, they're humorous, but they're absolute models of love rack. To me, the ultimate screwball romantic comedy is The Lady Eve, written and directed by Preston Sturges. In it, Barbara Stanwyck, another mainstay of this kind of movie. Barbara Stanwyck is a con artist. Her and her dad are con artists who are always bilking rich people out of money. They're always looking for victims. And she runs into hapless goofball heir to a million dollar fortune, Henry Fonda. And he's really a dope. He's really clueless, totally credulous character. And she runs into him and they bilk the living hell out of him. And and then it has a totally screwball plot. She's still in love with him, even though they've taken him for a ride, and she can't forget about him. She tries to re-enter his life as a different person. and and so her and her father show up again in his life, but pretending to be other people. And the father thinks they're setting him up for yet another soaking along with the rest of his family. But Stanwyck is torn. And this is an unusual love rack because she's drawn to him and he has no idea that the two women that fell in love with him are the same woman. I know it's ridiculous, but believe me, if you see the movie, it works because she really does play a different person. Stanwyck was an unbelievable actress. But what makes this unusual is, among all movies ever made, I've never seen this done in any other movie. Her motivations change 3 different times. Her attraction, her reason to be attracted to him, change to 3 entirely different motivations over the course of the film. I mean, she just can't stay away from this guy. She loves him, she despises him, she loves him again, and they're all for different reasons. It's just deftly written by Preston Sturges, who is a genius. If you ever see his name on a movie as either screenwriter or writer-director, you gotta check it out. Preston Sturges was a freaking genius. He's an amazing writer with a keen insight to the human mind, the human nature, and he just wrote some of the funniest movies ever made. And you need to check them out. But there it is, the love rack. You got to bring them together. You got to pull them apart. constantly. The tension cannot be relieved until the very last reel. Luke Johnson, the Fantastic Four comic was absent for a big chunk of the 2010s. In that time, Marvel gave rise to Guardians of the Galaxy and moved books like Avengers and Venom into the cosmic side of Marvel. Now, even after returning to print, they are still being out-cosmicked by the X-Men. Do you think the Fantastic Four can rise back to the prominence it once had in the cosmic side of Marvel, or is it doomed to be overshadowed by the new shiny titles until the corporate overlords give it a push when the next movie reboot comes out in 2028, probably? Yeah, the FF, they were the first cosmic book. They really were. They were the first one to introduce the cosmic elements to the Marvel Universe. And to my mind, they still did it best. A lot of the stuff that came after is a bit of a mess. It's not terribly consistent. FF was always consistent in its characterizations and all the rest of it. And it's funny, if you go back through interviews and magazines, every new Fantastic Four writer says the same thing. Well, the Fantastic Four are a family. As if they're the first ones that thought of that. As if when I was, 9 years old reading my first Fantastic Four comic, that didn't occur to me. They're a family. This is what makes them different. And the Fantastic Four is really about the micro rather than the macro. Yeah, the stories were huge and cosmic and universe spanning, but what they ultimately were was about the four and how they got along and their relationships with the outside world and all the rest of it. I mean, I mentioned soap opera and Spider-Man. There's an awful lot of soap opera and Fantastic Four, with the Thing and Johnny Storm's various stormy relationships, not to use a play on words. And Reed and Sue, would they get married? Would they not get married? Reed, the most distracted bachelor in comics, and and the humor, the apparent affection they had for each other, the tensions between them. I mean, this wasn't the Justice League of America. These four would get into fights with each other, and sometimes violent fights. That would nearly destroy the Baxter Building. But it was all, like a sibling rivalry. It's all in the family, and that's what the book's really about. It's not about the space-spanning adventures, that's all a part of it, But you start with these four, and they're out at the edge of the universe battling whatever cosmic menace there is, and we only care about it because we care about them. And they're big adventures because that's what Stan and Jack set up. They set this up as this was the big book. This was the big book. This is where all the big ideas came from. Galactus, Silver Surfer, Nihilus, all these other terrific characters, the Inhumans. This is where the Marvel Universe blew up and surpassed any, superhero universe that had come before it or after. But it's really at the heart of it is these four. It's the most aptly titled book in the world, the Fantastic Four. It's about the four of them. And if you get that right, you can get all the rest right. And you can introduce, the ultimate nullifier and Ego the Living Planet, and don't even bat an eye, because at the basis of it, these four, Reed, Sue, Johnny, and Ben, have made it all believable. They've given it all heart, and it makes us buy it. So, and I bought it. I just love the Fantastic Four, and I just think that they think too hard about it when they try to represent it. Just don't change anything. Just go back, think of new threats. It's like a James Bond movie. You come up with the villain's motivation, you got a James Bond movie. Don't change Bond. Don't change anything. Just challenge it. It's my argument that you don't make the story about the characters. You make a great story and you throw the characters into it. Come up with a wild, crazy, threat that threatens the life of planet Earth, and you stick the Fantastic Four in there to make it stop. And then you got a story. Chris Wojcik, I hope I pronounced your last name right. Columbo or Monk? This keeps coming up. I mean, I mentioned Columbo, and I get more Columbo questions. I mentioned Monk, I get more Monk questions. And yeah, I do enjoy both of these series. I enjoy both of these characters. And you're making me choose Columbo or Monk. It's like peanut butter or jelly. Choose now. Okay, Columbo. I mean, Columbo started. The guys who created it, Levinson and Link, came up with this formula that we see the murder, and it looks like the murderer's going to get away with it. He's a real smart guy. He's always or a woman. They're always effete. They're always elitist. They're always rich. They're always entitled. Dare I say, privileged. And it looks like they're going to get away with it. And here comes Lieutenant Columbo, the antithesis of whatever the murderer was. The murderer was, they were always these, bon vivant, boulevardier, wealthy people, well dressed, stylish, uh, top of society. And here comes this bum in his filthy trench coat, his stupid car, his stinky cigar, and his uncombed mop of hair. And he's going to give them a bunch of crap until they finally give in and say, I did it, I did it, I did it. He acts like an idiot. Yeah, he's like a clueless moron. There's no way this guy's going to figure out how I bumped my wife off and buried her in a trunk. But yeah, he's going to get you because you underestimate him, and that's the whole gag. And Levinson and Link, if you go back across their TV career, they wrote for Alfred Hitchcock Presents, I think The Naked City. They wrote for a lot of different TV series in the 50s and 60s, and it was always the same story. It was always this formula every single time. And ultimately, they wrote a play that appeared on Broadway. I think it was called Prescription Murder, and it introduces the Columbo character. And the play got optioned for television, and the rest is history. But these guys created a formula, and they never varied from it. And as much as we all love it, and as much as it's like mashed potatoes and gravy kind of entertainment, it was a formula. It was predictable. But that's kind of what made it fun, isn't it? So Monk is, kind of the same. We underestimate him because he's got problems. He's got serious ADHD, obsessive compulsive disorder. He's cowardly. He's a germaphobe. He's got all of these hang-ups. But he's a brilliant detective. He's a brilliant mind. It's brilliant analysis. But he's constantly underestimated because of his frailties. And it makes it interesting. But in the end, he always triumphs. He always figures it out. But what's different between Monk and Columbo, which is why I got to give Monk the nod as my favorite of the two, is that the writers on Monk never bowed to formula. Yes, the show's formulaic. There's a murder or some other kind of crime, and it's impossible to solve. And Monk is the only one who sees the answer, no matter how impossible his solution to the mystery is. It's going to be true, and most of the time, we did see the murder, and we're privy to evidence that he doesn't have. Although a lot of times on Monk, we didn't quite understand what we were seeing. We didn't quite understand how the murder happened, but we were certain of who did it in a lot of cases. And so they were always bending formula on the show. They were always playing with the formula. Also, a terrific ensemble cast, the addition of humor. Columbo could be funny, trust me. And that's the thing about both series. And I think that's why they compare to each other so often, is that they are so indelibly played by the people who played them. Tony Shalhoub as Monk is Monk is inseparable from Tony Shalhoub, as Columbo is inseparable from Peter Falk. But fortunately for both actors, it doesn't go the other way. Both actors were versatile enough that we didn't always associate them only with those characters. They never got typecast because they both had enough range that we never typecast them as the characters they were most famous for playing. But anyway, I got to give the nod to Monk because that writer's room was freaking astounding, and they never bowed to formula. They were always trying to think of different ways to bend the mystery genre and provide more and more surprises, and always trying to exceed the viewer's expectations. And then also the humor aspects. It's one of the funniest shows ever produced, as well as one of the most intriguing, whodunit shows ever. And always intelligent, like Columbo. They never pulled they never pulled the ending out of a hat. There was no contrivance. But yeah, I got to give it to Monk. Sorry, Columbo fans. Sorry, Lieutenant. Hey, Arkhaven, Arktunes. Have you checked out Arktunes? It's a free digital. I said free, no money. Free digital comic book platform. It's in high res. Maybe by the time you're hearing this, it's a phone app. I know they're working hard right now to make this into a phone app. So you can read it on your PC. You can read it on your laptop. You can read it on your Kindle because you got access to the internet. You can read it. It's so high res, you can read it on your TV set in your living room. I don't care how big the screen is. It comes through crystal clear. You can read comic books in your living room on a big screen TV for those of you with failing eyesight like me. And we've got dozens of stuff. I'm working on a really exciting series now with an artist I've never worked with, and he's killing it. It's a superhero parody. I can't wait to show you some of it. If you go to Arkhaven Patreon, you can see some of the stuff I'm talking about. Well, obviously, if you go to Arktunes, you can see all of it. But if you go to Patreon, Arkhaven, that's the Chuck Dixon Slush Fund. That's where I, humbly asked you to contribute so I can pay my artists. Anthony Gonzalez Clark and Frank Fosco and Tim Lottie. That's how I pay these guys out of the funds provided by you. And so far, I've been able to meet the bills, but I could always use more help. And of course, the more money in the kitty at Patreon, the more I can produce. And maybe someday I'll even pay myself. But for right now, it's all about creating content for Arktunes, which I beg you to check out. I know you're going to dig it. There's going to be something there. Like I said about manga in a previous video, there's lots and lots of different genres. There's something for everyone at Arktunes. Something for everyone, something for anyone. You will find something you like there. So please go check it out. Did I say it was free? Because it's free. Hey, that's it for this week. Thank you for listening. Thank you for watching. Thank you for liking and subscribing and sharing and all the things you've done to try to build this channel. And I will see you all down the road.